So welcome to the webinar, Catcher in the Server Room, WMS Saves the Day. We're going to hit these agenda topics as we move through the process. What is a WMS? Where to start your project or process? Going through selecting your vendor. What happens after you select a vendor? We're going to have a high-level discussion about costs and what they mean. What happens after you sign the contract, and then closing up with what's it take to succeed when you're going through this process. So to kick it off, blurred lines, what is a WMS? Back in the 80s, it was a pretty easy conversation. It's a piece of software that helps you receive, store, pick, ship, and pack your goods to your customers in an efficient manner, saving money and increasing productivity. But don't assume when you're going through this project or process that there's any single solution that will fit your project, or in that term, any one vendor that can satisfy every requirement that you've got. I mean, it could be argued that each of those bubbles in the bottom left represent a clear best of breed, and they delineate, amongst themselves. I could actually say that there may be some crossover between those four bubbles. And a lot of people will think there's kind of an implied hierarchy there, meaning an ERP, an enterprise resource planning tool, is the catcher's mitt at the very top, and it would dispense information down to the WMS, the WES, a warehouse execution system, or WCS. But I would argue that there's some complementary things that happen within each of these bubbles that would be implied to satisfy your requirements depending upon how complex you are. So there are ERP providers that have some light WMS, and there are some WES suppliers out there who have light WMS. So as you're going through the process, just do your homework, understand what happens within each of these different options as far as software is concerned. The next topic is where to start. So I would ask that you would ask yourselves, do you and your company have the wherewithal to take on a long-term full-time project like a WMS selection and implementation? There's some considerations at the bottom that you should also contemplate. First and foremost is, what do you have for future plans in your distribution operations? Are you growing? Are you stagnant? Are you in the right geography to service your customers? Are you changing over from more brick and mortar to online? So those are questions that you should ask not only from a current situation, but in the long term, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan. And the next, how long do you plan to use the system? It's surprising, or not surprising maybe, that a lot of our customers and our current clients who are in the distribution industry are contemplating putting out to 3PL for various reasons. It could be they don't want to be in the distribution business anymore and they would rather be in the brand business, or they can't hire or find enough people to satisfy the distribution requirements. So have that as a consideration, and that will help draw into whether this is the right time or the right place to take on a new WMS. The next
Greg, would you consider the fact that it's with people considering moving to a 3PL, that in effect, instead of choosing a WMS, they need a process to go through similar to what you're describing in this webinar today to choose a 3PL?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom, and thanks. So there's a lot of due diligence behind, selecting a 3PL as well. It has to do with location, and clearly the number one goal of most of the companies that we work with is satisfying their customer and their customer requirements. So not all 3PLs are a good fit for every company. Each have specific nuances that help them, deliver the goods on time to the places that you expect them to deliver to in the same shape and size as what you would expect it to do yourselves. So yeah, thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. The next one is, what's the best sites for you to distribute from? Are you in a single location today? Are you in a hub and spoke model? And if you are, do you have too many spokes or not enough spokes to make sure that you're satisfying the SLAs that you have to get to your customers on time? The next question I would have you ask is, what technology are you comfortable with? I mean, are you currently operating a system on a homegrown solution that you have servers in your warehouse or servers in your corporate offices? Are you familiar with and do you understand what it means to go to a SaaS solution as opposed to a perpetual solution? Because when it gets to the point where you're talking about looking at vendors, they all have their way of deployment deployment, and they have different flavors of software. Some have both a perpetual based software where you would either put the servers in your site or put them in the cloud, and some of them are pure SaaS based. So do your homework, make sure that you understand what you're looking at and what your requirements are to start the process in an efficient manner. The next section is selecting your vendors. So here's really where the rubber meets the road. There are a bunch of options available out there for you, and that's a fortunate thing. But there are different schools of thought on how you should identify the possible vendors. I mean, there's a lot of things written and a lot of things captured within the industry analyst bucket. There's studies and reports that are put out by Gartner and Aberdeen and Forrester and others. But keep in mind, just because they might be in the magic quadrant or on the top 5 of any one of these analysts, they may not be a good fit for you. And the reason I'm saying that is there are a lot of new up and comers. And when I say new, I will just call them vendors that are out there less than 3 to 4 to 5 years that are really good software solutions, but they just don't have the mainstream word of mouth. Also, I would suggest hit your LinkedIn, pull your contacts for the references. Chances are, if you go to any industry meetings or any industry shows, you have counterparts in your same industry that have done this in the past and can give you some friendly advice as to how you should start the process and who they've been happy with. The point is, sometimes analysts can be biased, and just keep that in mind. Then again, look at the thought leaders, the WMS solutions that are out there that may not be mainstream, but may be a perfect fit for your operations. Then the next step is creating an RFP, RFQ, RFI. So I just call them RFX. Who do you engage and how many do you engage? I'll tell you from experience at Alpine, and we do this, day in and day out. If you engage typically more than 4 to 5 potential vendors, you're really getting very deep into the pool and maybe causing yourself more work and headache than what it's worth. So try to pare them down if you possibly can to your 4 to 5 top vendors to start that initial process of distributing your RFX. So the home stretch. Now, this is really where the heavy lifting starts. So you're going through the process and you're going to be picking a vendor, ultimately your preferred vendors. Now, whether that is 2 vendors, 3 vendors, or 4 vendors, it would be hopeful that you could narrow it down to the final 2. And the reason I say that is if you get more than 2 as finalists, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, and one starts looking just like the other, and it's blurred lines, and it's hard to differentiate where you get to with regards to having a product demonstration for yourself. The next thing I would suggest is, the go-see-do. And it's one thing to hear the organization, whether it's the selling team or the implementation team, that gives you the product demonstration and explains to you exactly how their solution will work within your operations. It's another thing to go on site to one of their customers that is running the software so you can see it in person. Make sure that, because this happens all along, and you can call it bait and switch, you can call it whatever you want, just make sure that you're going to be visiting a customer of theirs that's using, if not the same version as you, no more than one version different than one that they're showing you, just to make sure that you're evaluating exactly what it is that you're going to be purchasing and deploying and implementing. Secondly, try, if you can, to get to a customer that's in your industry or operating environment that's kind of like yours. So if you're full pallets in, full pallets out, try not to go to an each pick operation. But more importantly, if you're an each pick operation, try not to get them to go to a customer that's a pallet pick operation. It just doesn't work well, and you're going to end up not getting the kind of output and seeing the thing that you want to see.
So Greg, are you saying that the industry aspects may not be as important as the warehousing style that you're involved in, or what?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, one way of talking about it is a vertical, right? So you may be in the food and beverage vertical, or you may be in the electronics vertical, or the pharmaceutical vertical. But I think what's as important, maybe if not more important, is to tie in your horizontal operations with your vertical. So you may be a food vertical that has to have catch weight processing or expiry date processing or lot control processing. They may take you to a food service company that doesn't deploy those types of things. So that's just an example of making sure that you're seeing not only your vertical if possible, but also the horizontal processes that you're going to. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. The next point is make sure that the customer that you're going to see understands that you're there to evaluate the vendor in all regards. Software is only a portion of it. You can buy and try to implement the best software solution for you that there is, but if you haven't taken into consideration the things that are beyond and above just the software, you haven't done your homework and you haven't done your due diligence. When they do come on site and they demo on site, I mean, we've all experienced the COVID dilemma where things are going virtual and things are going online as opposed to face-to-face. I would suggest that to get the most out of your experience of the product demonstration is to have them face-to-face and across the table from you. Now, most vendors will come to the table and do that, and the expense is on their dime, not on your dime. So if at all possible, and if you're comfortable with it, I would suggest that you host those vendors at your facilities so they can be there and look at it. After you've gone through all that, make sure that they're demoing to you a day in the life. Don't give them the easy option of coming in and demoing to you their day in the life from receive, store, pick, pack, ship. Make sure that when you're doing this demonstration and you've prepared the demonstration for them, that you've put your half a dozen, 10, 12, whatever it is, unique capabilities and unique services that you provide your customers and ensure that they can do that well and do it the way that it fits your requirements. I love and hate RFPs. They're a very good barometer to catch the high level, top layer of functionality. But what they don't do, and what they also do, is give the vendor an opportunity to answer yes to a question based upon what little they know about the question. So make sure that you're doing a good job when you're preparing your RFXs, that you're describing to them exactly what it is you're looking for. And it doesn't hurt to call out the fact that these questions, some of which will be part of the demonstration. Now, once you've gone through all that and you've picked your vendor, I would suggest that you pick your number one vendor who you want to move forward with, but I would also keep second place in your pocket. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. If they've done a good job as vendors, they should have come in pretty close to being first and second. That is, if in fact you did your homework and you picked those vendors that would meet or exceed your requirements. But I, again, would suggest you keep second place, because I can tell you from experience, the first place may fall apart when it gets to the deeper dive contract negotiations, how well you get along with the executives from the other company, how they want to promote their implementation process, statement of work, project plan, the other things that come into play when you're deciding on your final vendor. At some point, you will end up with the winner, the clear winner, and it would be at that time that you would let second place know that they are no longer in the running, but you appreciate their time. The next slide is about cost, right? So there's really two facets with regards to cost. There's a licensing facet, and then there's the implementation. I'll take licensing first. So once you've known who your vendor is, you will have already decided whether it's a subscription-based or a perpetual license. You should have already decided if the software will be hosted or on-premise. So those things should have been made up front, so you're not running into, gosh, I really like your software and I really didn't understand that it was only provided in a SaaS or a subscription-based license. So make those decisions up front. And then the next one, when it comes to choosing your options, pricing is a clear and a big consideration, but it's also the negotiation of those prices. So ask yourself, and this is one of our polls that we had earlier, how many contracts of this magnitude have you successfully done on your own? And the preponderance of you said none, or some said a few. But I can tell you that this process is usually not quick and easy. Vendors have gotten easier to work with, specifically when it comes to a subscription-based license, because then you're looking at primarily your SLAs that you want to have deployed and your uptime that you want to have deployed. The next one you might ask yourself is, is this better to negotiate these prices at the end of a quarter or at the end of the year, or does it really matter? I will tell you that if it's a subscription-based SaaS model, as far as the vendor is concerned, it really doesn't matter when you're negotiating that price, because they're only recognizing a portion of that revenue that would be streamed out along either a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, or longer term of that contract. However, if it's a perpetual based license where you're paying for the lion's share up front, public and private companies usually operate on a calendar year, and you're better off making those negotiations at the end of the quarter or at the end of the year. It can make a difference. The second part of the cost bucket is implementation, and license fee clearly is only one side of the equation. Usually, and this happens more often than not, the implementation costs exceed the license fee. If it's a perpetual license, somewhere between 1.5 and 2x what the license costs from a perpetual standpoint. If it's a subscription-based license, if you added up the 3 years worth of monthly payments or yearly payments that you're making, it equals to be about the same 1.5 or 2x of that cost as well. So if you're looking at vendors and comparing price of the software license to the cost of the implementation, that's a good barometer. If your implementation fees come in drastically lower than this guidance, I would suggest that you do more homework and try to figure out exactly what it is that you're seeing the difference between your top two vendors in your implementation costs. I can tell you from experience, they should be reasonably close to one another with regards to implementation. If they're not, there may be from an implementation cost, and they're listed here, but I'm going to go through them quickly. How complex are your operations? Are you pallet in, pallet out? Do you not have any requirement with and integrate to? If you do, that could add some complexity and some time to your implementation plan. There's going to be scope creep. It always happens. Build it into your plan, build a buffer. I would say that out of all the projects that we do from a vendor standpoint, that scope creep usually is in the 15 to 20% range. So just build it in. The next thing you want to look at is the vendor that I'm looking at pretty much an out of the box fit for me, meaning most software providers today in today's world should be in the 90 to 95% out of the box fit, which means there's going to be a 5 to 10% part of the functionality that either needs to be changed with regards to labels, process flow, and regarding how you're operating. Next, ask yourself, what is my willingness to change? How am I going to be capable to bend my operations in order to suit what I'm expecting out of the solution that comes out of the box, and I can fit that into my process flow. The next thing that you should ask yourselves is, do I have the wherewithal within my company to take on this implementation process on my own? What the vendors oftentimes won't share with you is that if you were to look at a project plan or a statement of work, there's a part of that responsibility that falls in the lap of the vendor. But there's also a large portion of that falls in the lap of the customer, which is you. And that would be unit testing, training. These are just a couple of examples that you should take into consideration. So we call that the client side responsibilities. So ensure that when you're talking to those vendors and they're putting together project plans, that you have them specifically call out the percent of time on an FTE basis, a full-time equivalent basis, that you would expect input from you being the customer. So after the contract signed, as it starts, there's going to be some growing pains. You need to help, work with the vendor to put together a very detailed project plan. Make sure that there's nothing that's left out. Make sure that all bases are covered. And most vendors have this. It's a day in, day out part of their process that they do. And they're very familiar with what your expectations should be. Also, don't forget to look at your partner ecosystem. So there's going to be interfaces and there's going to be integrations that are there. If you have the wherewithal within your current environment, we'll just say you're going to be integrating this new WMS to an ERP, whether it's an off-the-shelf ERP or a homegrown ERP, there's going to be integration efforts that are required there. There's a lot of integration partners out there that are available to help subsidize maybe your technical side or your IT side of the argument to make sure that it gets done correctly. Integration is always going to be the long pole in the tent. It's going to be there no matter what you do. It's going to integrate to something. The next call out would be when you get introduced initially to your vendor project manager, make sure that you guys get along with them. It's not unheard of for you to go back to the vendor and say, hey, me and this project manager, whomever it might be, just don't see eye to eye. Let's look at some resumes for some other options that I've got, and try to do that before you get very deep into the project, so there's not a lot of time wasted in the changeover. I would say as you're going through this, integration clearly, long pole in the tent, but the two that sometimes don't get as much time spent on them as they should is testing and training. So when you test it, retest it, rinse and repeat. You can't test it enough. And then lastly, don't shortcut the training. Training is an important facet. It's the timing. How early do you train? How late do you train? And how often do you train? But make sure that that's a line item that's in big bold letters on your project plan. So with all that said, what does it take to succeed? So there's a lot of schools of thought around this. I would say the top line is probably one of the more important or most important is you have to have strong leadership provided by executive management. Now, don't misread that. Executive management, or I guess I would call it top down, is extremely important because you need positive reinforcement from those people that started this project in the first place. But I would argue that probably as important or more important is the bottom up. So the people who are going to be out on the floor using the system day in and day out, those that will be engaged with, making sure that you're successful when you're implementing it, when you turn it on election. Generally, the selection and implementation teams are composed of your best resources that represent all functions. So keep in mind when you're looking at those people and you're having them help do the training or the testing, that a lot of those individuals might bubble to the top and you find your next superstar supervisor or your superstar lead person. Stay focused on your goal, be deliberate in the process and the methodology. Try not to deviate from that and try to keep the main thing the main thing. Again, also just as important is change management, right? Things are going to change within your operation. And the point I want to make here is if you're buying software to replace exactly what you're doing today, I would question why you're going through the time and expense to buy software in the first place. The companies that are providing software to you are thought leaders. They're generally best practice industry-wide, and they will help you get more use and more productivity out of your operations than what you were doing in the past. So try not to duplicate a bad process. Then lastly, look at implementation as an ongoing process. So you may or may not have heard the term MVP, meaning I want to deploy the most important and the most valuable processes first. And that is a great approach and it's a great idea. But don't fall prey to what happens a lot where they get through successful implementation going through an MVP strategy and forget completely about all those other very, very deliberate enhancements that the WMS provides to you. And I'll just throw a couple out there. Task interleaving. Most vendors will tell you not to turn that on on day one. I think I would argue that that's, debatable, but we'll just say it's not a day one, phase one go live. Don't forget that those options still exist, and it could be something that you deploy in phase two. So don't lose sight of more functionality as you gain control and learn to work with your system on a day in, day out basis. With that, let's get to some Q&A.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. This has been really informative. We have some questions. I would encourage those who are attending today to go ahead and either use the chat or use the Q&A. Just roll your mouse over the Zoom screen. You'll see them pop up where you can click on them and you can enter in additional questions for us. The first question I want to ask, Greg, that we have out here is, how do you get over the hurdle of a company that wants to buy a new system, but they really want to do everything the old way?
I'd say there's two sides to that argument. The first side of the argument would be if they are already a best-in-class supply chain company and have done everything that they know to do to make sure that they're getting the best productivity, the best throughput, and the best SLAs that they can have, but they have to make a change because of the technology shift, or they have to make a change because they can no longer support a perpetual license with servers in their server room and they want to go cloud-based. I would say if you would fit into that category, I'm not saying some of you on the phone don't, most do not, then look at it from it's a replacement as opposed to an enhancement or best of breed solution.
Well, if you have a lot of existing processes that you want to just maintain and continue, but you're looking at a SaaS solution or a cloud solution, and you talked earlier about how good a fit am I out of the box? Well, what if you're not a good fit? How does that work?
If you're not a good fit out of the box as a replacement,
yeah,
I would say that you probably haven't done enough homework on the potential providers that are out there. And that goes back to my initial. If you are familiar with the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and I'm just going to pick on those guys for a second, and you're focused only on the top right quadrant of the thought leaders and ability to execute, and they may not fit with what you do as a business model or your culture, there are a lot of thought leader WMS providers out there that are not on the Gartner Magic Quadrant for various reasons. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because they don't fall into what I would call the analyst's top 10.
Well, having been a former Gartner guy, I will tell you that the guys in the top right tend to be the heavy lifters, the big projects, the large amount of implementation effort, and also the priciest. So sometimes you don't even want to look at those guys because of that. Exactly. But the question comes back to, though, then, is there something in the way these vendors are offering cloud-based solutions that enables you to have differences for yourself, but not be, totally out of the park with regard to what they would normally offer? Do they give us ways to allow us to have that individuality versus the industry?
Yeah, sure. So you can look at this in two ways. One would be, and I'll break down kind of the main difference between some of the software vendor providers. And you can look at them as a tool-based solution or a rule-based solution. So if you talk about a rules-based solution, those would be the vendors who would tout configuration as a yes/no switch. Do I do catch weight? Yes, no. Do I expiry date? Yes, no. Do I lock control? Yes, no. Do I do appointments for receipt bookings? Yes, no. So those would be, I would say, a rules-based. On the other side of the spectrum, there's tools-based providers that allow you to be more willing to bend a process, and they will design it based upon a process flow, and it's as simple oftentimes as a drag and drop on a Visio that says, here are my 5 steps to complete this process. And if I'm rules-based, I got to stick with those 5 steps. If I'm tools based, I can insert a step that says instead of doing X after Y, I want to insert a new process that allows me to do something different and significant in order to enhance my business model. Thanks.
Okay, so you know, when we look at this, we look at the idea of our existing processes and the existing software, and then we talked about, you know, successful implementation is about getting buy-in from the ground up and involving the best employees. But these best employees all have day jobs. How do you get buy-in, and how do you take care of putting the best players in your organization into the mix to help select and implement the new solution going forward?
Well, again, I would say that this process is not one that is easy, and it's not one that's there's a written script to get from point A to point B. But I would say that making sure that you're engaging a company, a consulting firm, if you don't have that wherewithal, that has gone down this path before, that has hit the roadblocks, that understands that there are positives and negatives to doing, steps 1 through N as a be there. So do your homework, look out to figure out if there's a company that fits from a consulting standpoint to help you down that path so you get there more easily. Think of it as a river guide, right? So you're going to go down this river and you've got a bunch of people pushing and paddling left and right. Let that consultant be the guy in the back of the boat and make sure that you get from the top of the river through the rapids and to the boat dock without much carnage.
Actually, I kind of have a question along that lines, and the attendees may have recognize this as somewhat self-serving, but you kind of opened the door there with it. Why is it, what is it that customers can expect to get, or the value they can receive by using a third-party consultant to help them do the selection?
Yeah, thanks. So I would say first and foremost, whomever you engage, if you decide to do that, this process is something that they've done repeatedly. So they've probably already got a list of, the top 10 vendors that they have worked with in the past, and have also their ear to the ground for those new up and comers that may be a good fit for you based upon what your requirements are. Secondly, I would say that they're there to help you with these processes. They are not there to make the final decision for you. So oftentimes it's confused that you employ a third-party consultant, and they're the ones that are going to come to the boardroom and say, here's who you should pick, here's who you should pick. And that's really not the role of that consultant. The role of that consultant is to show you all the different shades of gray, and then make you guys, or make the customer, be the end factor in determining the best fit for them. Because once the implementation is over with, if you use that same vendor for the client side responsibilities, once all that's turned on and you're happy and merchandise is flowing in and out of your building, I won't say that that vendor or that consultant goes away, but now it's back to you, and you're going to be living it day in and day out.
Okay, so you've mentioned client-side services a couple times in the presentation, and again just now in your response. But you recognize that until you have an implementation plan, you don't know all of the pieces that are going to be involved. But in the early stages of life, working through one of these selections, are there any rules of thumb for the clients to kind of get a handle on how big is that client-side services breadbasket compared to what the vendor is going to do, say, for example?
Yeah, so I'll just give you kind of a general rule of thumb. And again, this is general. So if I were to take the last 5 WMS implementations that we've been a part of and have the client-side responsibilities, I'll just say an average project is about, we'll just call it somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 hours. And that's on the vendor side only. The client-side responsibilities, which would be either something that the customer does all by itself or with the help of a consultant, is generally in the 30 to 40% range of those same hours. So I was told there wouldn't be any math, but we'll just say it's a 2,000-hour project plan. You can count on the client-side responsibilities to be anywhere between 750 to 1,000 hours worth of full-time equivalents dedicated to making sure that you're successful on this project. So it's a big part of the pie.
Great. So one last question. How do you handle an executive that heard on the golf course on hole 14 the exact solution that he thinks you ought to have, and he wants to interject that into the middle of your selection process?
You know, if they're an executive in the C-level, we're certainly going to listen, but also have to temper it with the reason why behind it. And we've run into a couple of projects where we were given this as the option, and we had to follow the guidance of that executive. I would say in the last couple or three that we did, and we're given the guidance that we have to recognize this potential vendor as part of the puzzle, they were excluded very early. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but if you look at this from a top-down executive sponsorship role, but also lay in the bottom-up buy-in role from those people that are going to be out kicking the boxes every day, you're going to be more successful.
Yeah, I always look at it as, in this context, I say, don't fight it. Take that vendor's name, put them in the process, make them follow it, compare them to everybody else, let the process sort it out.
Exactly.
So I've got another question here. Actually, I think we covered this one in some regard. So I think that kind of covers the topic for today. Do you have any other final parting words, Greg?
Yep. Just give me 1 second. Get back to the slide where. So if you're interested in learning more, schedule an appointment with Alpine. We do an initial process called a best practice assessment, where we come on site, we spend a couple of days, we figure out what you're doing great, we figure out what you're not doing so great, and help you decide whether one of your alternatives might be to look at a new WMS or improve the solution that you have today. There's our contact information. I'll pause on this slide for just a second. We're coming to the end, so hopefully everybody's madly writing down contact information. Our next webinar is being hosted on August 18, 2021. Steve Silvis is one of our managing directors, and he's going to be talking about Charlotte's Web, network design, and how to meet your SLAs. With that, I would say thank you. We really appreciate the time that you spent on the phone with us. We were scheduled to go till 2 p.m., so I'm going to give back about 14 minutes of your day.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day.